Welcome to Everyday Elevations. I'm your host, Jason Fricka, and I'll be taking you on a journey towards holistic health, discovering the power of transformation through expert interviews, in-depth research, actionable advice, and personal growth stories.
Welcome back to Everyday Elevations. Today we have a special guest. We have Daniel Gospodarek, and he's a licensed clinical social worker here out in Denver, Colorado. He sustained a traumatic brain injury in 2009 from a motor vehicle accident. And through his recovery process, he began to explore the social work profession and ways to give back to the community in which he lives. And so with that, I'd love to just let Daniel tell a little bit about his story here, how he came to this point in his life.
Yeah, for sure. Thanks for having me, Jason. Happy to be here. Excited to reach out and touch your listeners with my story, and hopefully it can inspire some other people too. As Jason mentioned, I'm a licensed clinical social worker here in Denver, providing therapy to people who can't commute into Denver, but also via telehealth throughout all of Colorado. And as Jason mentioned, I sustained a traumatic brain injury in July 2009, going into my senior year of high school. It was a one vehicle accident. So we ended up rolling 4 times. After that, I don't remember anything. I woke up 3 days later in the ICU. But essentially from that point after we rolled, the driver, who was not knocked unconscious, was able to find our cell phones and call EMS. When EMS got there, he was also speaking to his mother. My friend's mother they were talking, and she's actually happened to be a nurse, and she kind of explained like, hey, if he has a traumatic brain injury or some sort of head injury, right, that going to a rural hospital isn't going to be enough, that you need to take him to a higher trauma level hospital. And that's what they ended up doing. That decision right there may have highly impacted my survival probability.
Yeah, no, I can't even imagine going through that. You still keep in contact with the individual, correct? And you're still pretty close. You call each other like on an annual basis, or you reach out to them on an annual basis?
Yeah, it's usually the anniversary date. Like we'll exchange a few messages. But even like right after the accident, he and his family were coming up to the hospital to visit me. He was outside of my immediate family. Once I was able to like actually start to navigate the world again, he was the only person outside my family I trusted to drive me in a car, because they pulled my license because of the level of head injury I had. He was the only person I trusted to drive me outside my immediate family, just because I knew he would do what needed to be done if he had the capabilities. And then he was also the first person I got back into the gym with. We started running together. So we started healing a little bit together afterwards. So that was really cool.
So it kind of brought you even closer together with that accident there. I'm going to backtrack just a little bit, because by jumping to that question, I kind of jumped a little bit ahead, unfortunately, because I'm kind of curious. Now, you had a traumatic brain injury.
Yeah.
How did that affect you? Because you were in the hospital for 3 days, you woke up in there. How long were you in the hospital for? And then once you got out, how did that affect you getting back into school? This is your senior year of high school, so a critical year for you.
Yeah, there's a lot of details inside those. Yeah, I spent 17 days in the hospital, so 10 days ICU, 7 days inpatient rehab, and then did 3 months of physical therapy and then 17 months of speech therapy afterwards, outpatient. It was definitely the long haul. And we're just starting that process, right? So I needed to have brain surgery. And then I had a stroke in my left prefrontal cortex, fractured skull, and then a collapsed lung. So all those pieces kind of culminated in, we don't know if he's going to need to relearn how to talk just because of the area of the brain that I injured, relearn how to walk. So a lot of these questions are kind of up in the air, but a lot of them also couldn't be answered because I was in a coma for 3 days. And then when they started taking me out, I wasn't fully mobile yet. So I was still in the hospital bed. They started interacting with me, and I started interacting with staff and my family, and was able to converse. So they knew the language part was there. And then it wasn't until they were able to take a lot of the tubes out of me that I think it was in the ICU that I ended up walking for the first time with holding onto a wheelchair and having 3 nurses around me. So going from a highly functioning individual beforehand to being able to walk with 3 nurses holding on to you with a wheelchair, right? There's a huge shift in terms of independency and agency and just kind of like your self-efficacy in this world, right? So there's a lot of humility in there, but there's also a lot of like shame where you're like, am I really in this position?
Yeah, like you don't feel like you're a strong enough person anymore, things like that. I can only imagine what's going through your head at that time. Yeah. Out of pure curiosity, were you like a athlete or anything prior to that? Because I'm just kind of curious what the level of struggle for you would have been with, like, say, if you were like a high class athlete.
Yeah,
I'm sure the struggle is going to be hard regardless. Mm-hmm. But then you go from having no real control over your legs. I can imagine that would just put you in a whole different mindset.
Yeah, this was going into my senior year of high school, so I wasn't playing sports at the time, but I played the first 2 years of high school, and I played all the years leading up to that since like 4th, 5th grade. And one of the things they did say was probably that the physical strength that I had, and again, I was still working out like before the accident, 2, 3, 4 times a week, depending. And they said that part, the physical capability of going into the accident, was probably one of the things that also helped us move through the recovery process afterwards, right? In terms of not just physical strength, because that kind of goes out the door. And I walked around the nursing station, right? Like one time a day. It wasn't like I was walking miles or running or squatting or anything. I think I went into the accident weighing like 180 or 190. And when I left the ICU, I was 20 pounds less, just from all of the limited eating, right? I mean, they're feeding you on liquids pretty much, right? So a lot of that physical piece ended there, but it definitely helped during the immediate accident, right? A lot of what goes into recovery, I mean, from mental illness, TBI, trauma, right, is the mentality piece, right? That this is going to be a long haul. It's almost forced patience, right? And the more you wrestle with that forced patience, almost the worse it is.
Yeah. I mean, that makes perfect sense. And like I said, forced you to have a little patience. I'm curious how things were when you got to high school. Because I mean, as we both know, and I'm sure anybody listening to this will know, kids are kind of really freaking mean in high school. So I'm just curious if you had any issues when you came back with that and how you adjusted to high school itself.
Yeah. So that was one of the first mentality pieces that I was told. That's kind of where I noticed like the shift in terms of my recovery was, I'm pretty certain I was in the ICU when they said that I probably wouldn't graduate with my cohort that I started with. And I told them I would, and I did. And I also attribute that to mentality, yes, but also my high school was extremely supportive. So they on one of the orientation days for all the students, they mentioned what I'd gone through. They give me kind of space on the stairs or in the hallway, because I was not unstable, but I didn't have my strength and my balance was off, all those pieces, right? So they wouldn't like avoid me, but they would give me space as if I walked down the hallway, right? The other super beneficial thing that they did was fatigue is a huge part of TBI recovery for some people. And I was sleeping 12, 14 hours a day at night. It just happened that my credit load for graduating high school was at a point where we operated on a block schedule. So it was only 4 classes a day, but they're 1.5-hour-ish piece. What I would do is I would go to school for the first 2 classes and then come home and sleep and take a nap for like 1 hour to 3 hours. And then I did that for the first semester. And then by the second semester, I could go a full day and then with a half day.
Gotcha. So they just worked with you with the schedule for that part because you had to get the extra rest in order for you to function in general.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I pretty much would just zone out if I couldn't sleep.
Yeah. It wouldn't benefit you or them to have you there just not being there. Being a poor high school student, I can imagine how that makes them feel. I did not always have the full focus I should have had. Better than in college. But that's amazing that your school was so supportive. Because one of my biggest fears, just because with this, is I was like, man, I can only imagine going through that and knowing how so many schools are so, not necessarily schools, but you're always going to have kids who are toxic that want to bully people. And it's amazing to hear how receptive they were to you and taking care of you. So I love hearing that.
Yeah.
with that, so high school, clearly you graduated, you did great, you hit your goal when you had all the support in the world there. At what point did you decide you wanted to become a licensed clinical social worker?
There was a series of points at first when I got home. So I had to be under 24/7 supervision for the first month or so, just because of possible seizure activity and stuff. And my sister's also a social worker, and her and I had been talking just about my time, and especially in inpatient rehab, just because I was a little bit more coherent and tracking what was going on. And while I was in that part of my recovery process, I knew that I would be somewhere in the helping profession, but I didn't know where exactly in terms of nurse or physical therapist or speech therapist. And then I started speaking with my sister about a month or so later. And then she was like, check out this profession. So I did. And I was like, yeah, this kind of intrigues me, right? It's pretty dynamic. You can do a lot of different things. And this was only my bachelor's at that point. So I got my bachelor's and started working. And I was like, yeah, like this is important work and I love it. And I also realized it's not what I really want to do or be able to do. So that's what led me then to the master's, the licensed clinical social worker track. There's a series of kind of milestones in terms of education and just professional development of seeing what I could do, what my capabilities are.
Awesome. Yeah, I was just curious, like how because you had your traumatic brain injury. I know you deal with a lot of recovery process. Like a lot of times when people have such a traumatic injury, they tend to go into that type of profession. Like, let's say you were in a huge fire and the fireman saved you. I actually have a couple friends who became firefighters because that's what they remembered. It just dominated their childhood memories, and that was their heroes. So they moved into it. So, it's one of the things I always love to ask that question when someone comes into a profession that directly relates to an incident that happened to their life.
Yep. Yeah. I mean, before the accident, I didn't really have a trajectory in terms of where I wanted to go. It was either going to be business or the military or something like that, or I didn't really know what to do. So definitely, I think myself, and I think a lot of people, maybe even some of the listeners, can resonate or even kind of reflect and say, these pieces are such defining moments of my life that they are very, some people call them choice points or milestones, whatever they are, right? When we can use that stressful situation or trauma or whatever it is, like a foundation of fuel, right? Like it can keep us going through a lot of crazy stuff and endure a lot of painful things that will come along in the process of obtaining whatever we want to do.
Oh, I like that. I mean, people can find a way to get to where they need to get to through some of that pain. I know that's kind of where I got into my profession. It was just, I don't want to go too much into it, but I got into HR because I wasn't happy with my transition out of the military, and I wanted to help prevent that for other military members. So that's how I got into that. Again, without going to a whole big spiel. Talk to me a little about your practice currently. So some of the things you do to help traumatic brain injuries and things along those lines.
Sure. So I work with people who have traumatic brain injuries. It's not the only thing I treat or support, right? But so the TBIs are part of it. Trauma, PTSD, complex PTSD, and then the mental illness or mental health challenges on the other side of like bipolar depression, psychosis, schizophrenia, right? And sometimes all these things kind of go together too. So that's the interesting part. But a lot of what we work through in terms of any kind of mental health challenge is symptom management, right? Learning skills to manage symptoms, setting up routines in your life to ensure that your quality of sleep, diet, all these things kind of natural wellness are there holistically. And then also looking at some of the subtle changes in terms of identity, in terms of grief and loss, right? Like for me, going into that senior year of high school, right? Like a lot of my friends are having bonfires and hanging out on Friday nights, and I'm literally sleeping at 7:30, right? And then hearing about all these things Monday at school, there's a huge disconnection, right? And that can be painful over time, because you feel maybe isolated because you need to isolate to take care of yourself. But you also feel maybe feelings of rejection or like you don't fit in, right? And that was more of like my points in terms of where I was in my life going into senior year. But if you're 30 or 50 and you have a traumatic brain injury, or you experience some level of trauma and you can't do the work that you used to do, right? Even though you're a provider for the ones that you love, right? Now that's not only on you, but that's also maybe a change in socioeconomic status of your family, right? So there's grief and loss and identity shifts through all of these components. And then shame, guilt. I mean, it's a wild ride, but I love supporting people on it.
Oh, that's incredible. You had mentioned some tips that you give them to set themselves up for success. What are some of those tips that someone can utilize?
Yeah.
Maybe something they can use even outside of if they have like any type of trauma too.
Mm-hmm. So I think it's going to depend on the person. There's not just like a one tip, right? But making sure like routine sleep is a big one, right? Regular sleep patterns, regular diets, right? Eating like we learned about the food groups, right? Growing up in school, right? But making sure you're getting healthy food, right? Not just processed food all the time. Regular exercise, right? Whatever that might look. Now, everyone's ability is different. So everyone can go into the gym and, squat or deadlift, right? But if there are ways to maybe go for walks or even find stationary pieces of exercise equipment, right? Like one of the things I used, and I don't even know the name of it, so I'm just going to do the motion here in a little bit. When I was in inpatient, it was essentially like a bicycle for your arms, right? And it just had resistance, right? And like that still worked your muscles, that still got your blood flowing, right? That still increased your heart rate. So pieces like those kinds of tips are huge. Finding ways to connect with things that you value are another big one. So for me, being outside, nature helps me ground, helps me regulate. Being around water is another big one for me. I grew up in Wisconsin next to Lake Michigan. It's a big one for me. So hearing the waves, right, the smell, whatever it might be, are all kind of rhythmic for me. And we all have them. We just need to increase that awareness to like, what is it, right?
It makes perfect sense. I know for me, like when I'm stressed out, I like the sound of creeks and then the nature. So I love being in Colorado. I'm actually originally from Illinois. I think we discussed this before. Mm-hmm. So went to Wisconsin quite a bit. So I know exactly what you're talking about. We used to forgot what lake it was on. My dad used to take us to fish, but went there quite a bit of time. But yeah, like you said, those little things kind of help soothe you and help get you back into where you need to be mentally. So that makes perfect sense. It's funny you did the whole hand motion thing because my grandpa passed recently, but he was using that to kind of get some of his strength. And it was, so as soon as he said that, I was like, I know exactly what you're talking about. Mm-hmm. And those little things not only do they keep your body strength, they keep your brain active too. And that's one of the things I noticed with him. Like he still was keeping that active by doing those little actions.
Yeah. And I think you can also like influence your self-esteem, your self-image, right? Especially around maybe not just appearance, but like, okay, last week I could only do this for 30 seconds and now I'm at a minute and a half, right? Like I'm improving, I'm growing, right? And it's those little things that start to shift our perception of who we are, mm-hmm. how we sit with ourselves and those emotions that come up. It can be pretty powerful when we're in the moment.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. And I mean, I've seen it live in action. So that's one of those things where, because again, I'm just going to reference my grandpa because it's the most recent reference I have. Every time he was able to, he would do some leg exercise and he's like, I'm going to be able to get out of here and walk. And so each time he's like, I did this long. He's like, I'm doing it this many times every day. Like doing it on his own, even without the healthcare workers with him. So he had a physical therapist to come in to take care of him as well. But like, yeah, completely relate to what you're saying there because I've seen it. I've seen the strength in him as he was doing that and the mental fortitude that builds with it. Well, with that, talk a little about some more other work you're doing with the patients. Like, it's
a part of life, right? And it can be painful too. And I think giving honor to those emotions, right? Because even just grief and loss in general, right? I mean, it's natural. Other cultures around the world experience grief and loss, and they may express them or experience them differently, but it permeates, country lines, and it's also a testament of that relationship too, right? We wouldn't have grief and loss if there wasn't a connection.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. So trying to think of how to word this here, with someone who's looking for help with this, maybe they don't know the right path to go to ask questions to maybe intimidated by social workers, what would you recommend for them to do, where to research, things like that? How do you find the proper person for you to help?
That's a really good question. And I think there are a lot of therapists, a lot of, counselors, whatever you're looking for, psychologists, right? It's going to sound kind of cliche, but start with Google and start Googling, if you're having challenges with, isolation or just like low energy, low mood, right? Just start Googling people around you that could help you. And a lot of people in private practice offer 15, 20-minute free consultations. Right. And they'll be able to say, yeah, I think I can support you, or I can't, or I know somebody that might be a better fit. A lot of it also comes down to in terms of insurance, right? Or in terms of if somebody's able to private pay, or that conversation where you kind of weed some of that stuff out. And then it just kind of narrows that funnel down to where you need to go. But I think one of the pieces with recovery is that no one is going to do it for you. So there has to be some initiation, some action to start that ball rolling. But if you can keep the momentum going, it's much easier than starting and stopping and just going with it and rolling.
Okay, so I'm going to just rehash that a little bit here. One of the easy ways, obviously, Google finds everything for you, but really you have to know yourself. You have to know what your symptoms are. You have to be honest and open with your own self to understand what type of help you're going to need. So that's the first thing they're going to really need to do besides using Google, is understand that. And then from there, just open up. And as you said, there's plenty of therapists who will give you that 15, 20 minutes there to really discuss. And I know I've personally experienced this when I've called for various things. I got PTSD in the military. So it's one of the things where I first took a very long time for me to humble myself to figure out what's going on and to admit that there was an issue. And you go into the conversation, they recommend whoever, if they don't feel like they can fit your bill, and which was my case, they recommended me to one of their friends, and he's been very helpful for me. But that was one of those things where, I love giving people tips on and getting tips for people on how they can do the research. Because a lot of times they're just scared to ask questions. I know I was intimidated to ask questions. It's what took me so long to actually deal with my own traumas, because I wasn't willing to accept that. I guess it's a military background where you have to be gung-ho G.I. Joe, like nothing hurts you. And then you get that ingrained in your head, and then you don't want to admit that, hey, there is a problem. The military is much better with that. But during my time, we're still at the point where you don't really talk about feelings too much.
There are still Vietnam veterans out there white knuckling, and I'm glad to hear that some of those stigmas, stereotypes, right, are slowly shifting. And the military, the VA are large systems, and it takes a long time to shift. But if you can start with Googling that self-awareness, right, of like, oh, what might this be if I'm having challenges with, hypervigilance or always being on alert, not sleeping, whatever it is, and then start there and increasing your own awareness so you know what you're looking for. And also, too, if you have somebody that has used a therapist before and was happy with that experience, you can tap into that network.
That makes sense. Well, so we're getting close to the time here. I just want to make sure, is there anything else you wanted to speak on before we get ready to wrap things up?
Not like speak up, but just kind of a closing message of, we're all going to be hit with some level of adversity in life sooner or later, and sometimes even more than once or twice in our life. And again, it's how we use those adversity situations in that recovery process to fuel our internal flame to make those changes, not only in ourselves and our family and our friends, but also our communities. That's really going to start shifting this world.
Oh, that's beautiful. I 100% agree with that. That's amazing. Okay, so I have two questions I'd like to end with every person. I'm very anxious to see what your answer to this one is. If you could have any superhero power, what would it be and why?
Ooh.
I know. It's a very easy question, but it's so hard to answer at the same time.
Yeah, I think it would be to be able to fly. And the reason being is that we have families scattered around the country. And being able to just pick up and go would be awesome.
Yeah, then you don't have to take Delta Airlines or anything.
Yeah, or there was a movie, I think it was like early 2010, 2012-ish. I think it was called Jumper.
Yeah.
And if I could jump, I would prefer to do that, because then, my family and we could just hold hands and poof, we're there,
Yeah, I was going to say, maybe you should go with teleportation with that, because that, I'm sorry, I'm a little bit of a comic book nerd. So X-Men Nightcrawler, he teleports, so you can bring people with, just like you're mentioning in Jumper. So as soon as you said family, want to visit them, I was like, you might want, I think teleportation would be the perfect thing for you.
Yeah.
Awesome. And the other question, I always love to hear, what is a person's favorite quote?
It's not like a famous quote or anything. It was actually one of my high school teachers was dying, and we got to go see him before. I went with two other former students, and I can't remember who asked, but it was like, what's one thing you have left to teach us? Right? We're no longer your students. And he said that, and I can't remember the exact quote, but it was along the lines of, don't give up. When things get harder, you can't quit, or don't give up. Those are his last words to us. And that's something that resonates in my mind all the time.
That's amazing. I love that quote, because it's true. Things are getting hard in life, but if you push through, you're going to become a better person for it. So that's a perfect quote. I think one of my favorite quotes is from one of my mentors. He says, be where your feet are. So be present. And that's something I'm constantly trying to work on, especially in today's social media world and everything. Yeah, I love that quote. Love the superpower. I actually would like to teleport too. That's the same power I picked. And for similar reasons, but also selfish. I just want to go vacation wherever I want to vacation. But before we let you go here, where can people find you? What is social media links, website, things like that? This way we can, if they want to reach out, they can.
Yeah. So Instagram at revitalize_mental health. Facebook, Revitalize Mental Health PLLC, and then also just the website, revitalizementalhealth.com. Submit a form there. Call 720-295-6703. So we can connect pretty quickly usually.
All right, awesome. Thanks again for taking the time for this interview here, Daniel. It's great getting to know you a little bit more. I know it's a little early in the morning here. I truly appreciate it. I love learning more about how to take care of yourself when you're dealing with different mental health issues. And I love hearing more about your story. There's going to be plenty of people who can relate to this, and hopefully helps them open up to be able to reach out to get help if they haven't already. That's one of my big hopes with this call here. Thanks again. I absolutely love the time with you here.
Yeah, you too, Jason. Thank you so much for having me.
You are welcome.
Welcome to Everyday Elevations. I'm your host, Jason Fricka, and I'll be taking you on a journey towards holistic health, discovering the power of transformation through expert interviews, in-depth research, actionable advice, and personal growth stories.